It started with a rumble low steady and far too mechanical to be thunder. At my age, sleep is a fragile thing. Light, shallow, easily broken by even the softest creak of the floorboards. But this wasn't subtle. It was the unmistakable growl of diesel engines and the crunch of rubber tires over gravel, echoing up the hill behind my house. I rose slowly, my knees reminding me I wasn't the man I used to be. 82 years on this earth, and every joint now served as a weather vane for aches. I pulled on my flannel shirt, still soft from 100 washes, and walked to the kitchen window. The morning mist hung thick, draping the meadow in a gray-blue shroud. But through it I saw shadows, 3 of them large dump trucks, nosing their way down the path beside my southern fence line. Those trucks had no business being there. That land was mine, had been for over 50 years. My name is Raymond Ellis. I bought this property in 1971, when it was little more than a sloped pasture, 2 sycamores and a creek that danced in spring and sulked in summer. It wasn't much back then, but I made it my own. I built the fence myself, planted the cedars that now stand tall, and hauled gravel by the wheelbarrow load to shape the path winding past the creek. That gravel bed had formed naturally over decades, fed by runoff from the hills and the stream's gentle wash. I never sold a single scoop of it. Never needed to. So seeing someone haul it away set my blood boiling. I stepped onto the porch, coffee forgotten. The morning air cut through my shirt, but the fire in my chest kept me warm. From where I stood, I could just make out the orange blink of a truck's taillight as it crept beyond the tree line, dust billowing behind it like smoke. I didn't run after it. Not at my age. Instead, I took the long route through the barn, grabbed my field glasses from the pegboard, and watched from the rise near the orchard's edge. The trucks moved deliberately slow and purposeful, disappearing down the road toward the newer part of the development, the HOA-managed section, with its manicured lawns and community enhancement projects. I had my suspicions then, but I held my tongue. For now. Instead, I walked back toward the creek. That's when I saw it. A wound. That's the only word for it. A 30-foot stretch of the bank had been gutted as if a giant hand had scooped into the earth and torn out its bones. The gravel layered firm, built up naturally over decades, was gone, ripped away. The grass that once crept to the edges now hung like tattered curtains over exposed mud. Tire tracks pressed deep into the soft soil, clear as a confession. The brush I'd planted to stabilize the area was crushed roots, torn earth, still raw and unsettled. I crouched slowly, knees creaking in protest, and ran my fingers along the edge of what remained. The surface was scraped smooth as if raked with steel, and the smell sharp, disturbed earth, the scent of something taken without permission. It turned my stomach. I didn't call the sheriff right away. Small-town law enforcement doesn't move fast when it's the HOA in question. They share barbecues, poker nights, school fundraisers. Report something against the board, and they'll look into it sometime after the 4th of July parade if they remember. No. I went back inside, poured myself that cold cup of coffee, and sat down with my old field notebook. I'd kept records for years, not just because I'm meticulous, but because I used to be a land surveyor before I retired. Worked for the state in the 60s and 70s, measuring and mapping everything from hill lines to wetland buffers. It's a habit I never broke. Every rainfall, every erosion line, every shift in the creek, I wrote it down. So when I flipped through those pages and saw the last soil height measurement I'd recorded 2 months ago, I knew exactly how much had been taken. 14 cubic yards, maybe more. That's not a landscaping accident, that's theft. By mid-morning, I reached the edge of the HOA property, walking with my cane along the back trail that borders my land and theirs. The path was familiar. I'd walked it with my late wife, Ellen, for years before she passed. But now it felt different, harsher, as if the trees themselves had witnessed something ugly. At the edge of the lot sat a new, ugly tin-sided storage shed, and beside it, a pile of fresh gravel spread across a newly renovated picnic area. Tables had been set. A new walking trail curved gently to the left, bordered neatly with crushed stone that sparkled under the sun. Stone that looked very familiar. I stood there a long time, not angry, not yet, just tired. Tired of people thinking they could take what didn't belong to them. Tired of being seen as old and therefore harmless. And most of all, tired of my land being treated like an afterthought. The sign by the path read, Phase 3 Community Pathway HOA Beautification Project. Underneath it, gravel generously sourced and placed by board member initiative. I took out my phone, snapped a picture. It was the beginning. The next morning, I returned to the creek at first light. Fog clung to the water like a heavy breath, and dew soaked my boots as I walked the edge of the wound they'd left behind. In the early light pouring from the east, the damage was even clearer, more brutal. I hadn't overreacted. The gravel bed had been hollowed out as if by design. They hadn't just skimmed the surface. They dug deep, stripped away everything that held the slope together. Roots dangled like torn threads, and the edge of my fence, my grandfather's original line, reinforced, marked, and registered, was cracked, leaning from the vibrations of whatever heavy machinery they'd used. A full 15 feet of earth was missing. Eroded number excavated. I stood there a long while, cane planted in the soft ground, trying to quiet the surge in my chest. It wasn't just rage. It was grief. You spend half your life on a piece of land, you feel it in your bones. I could tell when the soil was too dry, when the rabbits moved deeper into the brush, when the hawks stopped circling because the mice had vanished. I'd walked this creek with my grandson. I'd scattered Ellen's ashes beneath the maple on the opposite bank, and now a part of that story had been ripped out by machines and carted away like it was nothing. The ache in my knees was nothing compared to the hollow in my chest. I turned back toward the house, and that's when I saw the second set of tracks. These came from the side road, an older, unpaved utility trail that the HOA had tried to block off years ago with a chain-link gate. It led directly into their Greenbelt corridor, the same area where they'd laid that shiny new walking path. And those tire tracks, they were the same pattern wide deep made by construction-grade dump trucks. They cut across my land, not near it, not beside it. Across it. I followed the path carefully, 1 foot after another, measuring with each step like I used to on the job. 50 feet, 100. That's when I saw the spot, a cleared staging area near the old oak tree, where they must have loaded the gravel before hauling it out. The grass was still crushed flat. Grease stains marked the soil. And wedged under a rock nearby, half buried in mud, was a piece of plastic sheeting. HOA issue bright blue stamped with the Crescent Hollow HOA logo. I picked it up and held it like a receipt. This wasn't just illegal, it was intentional. Back at the house, I dug out the county plat maps, the original ones, not the flimsy outlines you find online. I spread them across the dining table, tracing the boundary lines with a ruler's edge. My parcel extended all the way to the creek and 40 feet past it on the southern end. Their development line, according to county records, stopped at the eastern tree line. No overlap, no easement, no shared rights. They had taken material from land that was not only mine, but protected. I recalled a letter from years ago, sent by the county's Water Resource Board, informing me that a portion of my creek bed was designated sensitive habitat due to nesting salamanders and rare sedge grass. I'd signed the stewardship agreement without hesitation. It meant no pesticides, no dumping, no alteration to the natural water flow without written approval. If they'd taken gravel from that section, and I was nearly certain they had, it wasn't just theft. It was an environmental violation. And the fines for that, they weren't small. I picked up the phone and called the HOA office. It rang 6 times before someone answered. Crescent Hollow Homeowners Association, this is Mallory, said a voice already tinged with irritation. This is Raymond Ellis, I said evenly. I need to speak with your board president. It's urgent. A long pause. Then, Mr. Ellis, the board isn't accepting individual grievances outside scheduled meetings. If this is about landscaping or fencing, it's about the gravel you stole from my land, I cut in. You've got 10 seconds to explain what your trucks were doing on my creek bank at dawn yesterday. Silence again. Then I think you're confused, sir. That gravel was part of a pre-approved restoration effort for the Phase 3 Greenbelt upgrade. On my property, I snapped. Is that what you're calling restoration? Again, Mr. Ellis, I'm not authorized to discuss land use. You can submit a complaint in writing and attend the next. I hung up. I'd heard enough. They thought I was just a forgetful old man, a crank who didn't understand boundary lines or permits. They thought they could tear into my land while I slept and I'd be too slow, too weak, too irrelevant to fight back. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't going to play by their rules. I wasn't going to wait for the next community meeting where they could smirk behind their folding tables and cut me off after 2 minutes. No, I was going to do what I'd always done when someone tried to bully their way into my life. I was going to document. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter with my old Nikon, still sharp, still reliable, and took over 200 photographs. Tire ruts, gravel patterns, even the chipped fence post with fresh paint streaks. I used my surveying tapes to measure the exact width and depth of the excavation. Then I called a friend. Her name was Sandra Finch, a former intern of mine from my days at the HOA Department of Environmental Resources. She's now a regional field manager with the state. When I told her what happened, there was a long silence on the line. Then she said something that chilled me more than the morning air. "Ray, if they took that much gravel from the sensitive zone you steward, this isn't just illegal. It's felony-level environmental theft." I nodded slowly. "Can I send you the photos?" "Yes," she said firmly, "and I'll get a team out there, quietly. We don't want to tip them off yet." I ended the call and looked toward the creek. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass. The place looked peaceful again. But I knew better. I'd lived long enough to learn something most of these people hadn't. Just because it's quiet doesn't mean justice isn't coming. The next time I saw him, he was planting mums. Of all things mums. HOA President Bradley "Brad" Keys stood on the corner median near the subdivision entrance, wearing khaki cargo shorts and a tucked-in polo embroidered with the Crescent Hollow HOA emblem. He was grinning, shovel in one hand, plastic flats of golden flowers at his feet, as if he were the face of benevolence itself. A man beautifying the neighborhood. A man with nothing to hide. But I knew. I walked straight down the sidewalk. No hesitation. Cars passed, dogs barked in distant yards, but my focus didn't waver. My cane struck the pavement in a slow, deliberate rhythm, and with every step, my grip tightened. He noticed me at 10 feet. His smile faltered. Just a flicker, but it was enough. "Well, good morning, Mr. Ellis," he said too brightly. "Nice day to be out, huh? We're getting ready for the fall festival, always a favorite." I didn't smile back. "You sent trucks onto my land," I said plainly. "You took gravel from my creek bank. I measured the loss myself." Brad straightened, leaning on his shovel like it gave him authority. His eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses. "I'm sorry, what are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Brad," I said. 3 trucks, early morning 2 days ago. They came through the southern trail, cleared out 14 cubic yards from my bank, and dumped it into your walking path project." He laughed, actually laughed. "Ray, come on. 14 cubic yards. That's a lot of dirt. You think we just stole it?" "You did steal it," I said, voice steady. "And you crossed onto protected ground. That stretch of creek is part of a registered watershed stewardship agreement. You didn't just commit theft. You violated state environmental code." Brad raised his eyebrows, chuckling again, but it sounded tight. Forced. "I think you're confused, sir. That land's been a gray area for years. Half the board thought it belonged to the HOA. There's been talk about unclear boundary lines since that old survey map came up at the county, and we were told I am the one who filed that survey map I cut in. I drew those lines myself. I was a state-certified land surveyor for 30 years. There's nothing unclear about them, and I have the original documents to prove it." His jaw stiffened. "I'm not here to argue," I continued. "I'm here to tell you what you did was illegal, and I've already filed the evidence with the State Environmental Department." That stopped him cold. His hand slipped from the shovel. His mouth opened, then closed. For a second, the man beneath the polished image appeared calculating, cornered, angry. "I don't know what kind of story you're spinning," he said, quieter now. "But if you go around accusing people of crimes, you better be ready to back it up." "I've got the photos," I replied. "Measurements, soil core samples. I even have one of your branded construction mats left behind in the mud. Your signature's all over it. So, yes, I'm more than ready." He took a step toward me, eyes narrowing behind the dark lenses. "You think the HOA's just going to roll over for you," he said. "You know how many people I've got behind me? Half this neighborhood depends on that board. They're not going to side with some old crank who lives outside the development." I felt the sting, not because it was true, but because it was the weapon men like him used: condescension. I didn't flinch. "I may be old," I said, "but I'm not blind and I'm not stupid. You think age makes me irrelevant. Son, I've lived long enough to watch men like you rise and fall more times than I can count. You smile for the crowd, talk about flowers and festivals, But you think no one notices what you do in the shadows. He didn't answer. He just looked away, pretending to adjust a flower pot that didn't need adjusting. If you had asked, I added, if you'd shown up at my door and explained the project, maybe I would have helped. Maybe I would have donated the gravel. But you didn't. You took what wasn't yours. And now you're going to learn what happens when you cross the wrong quiet man. I turned and walked away, each step deliberate. Each strike of the cane a reminder I was still here, still standing. And I wasn't going to be ignored. Behind me, I heard him muttering something under his breath. But I didn't need to hear it. The shift had happened. He knew what I knew, and he was scared. Back home, I reviewed the file I'd sent Sandra. She'd acknowledged receipt. Criminal extraction on registered habitat, she called it. Likely Category 2 violation under the state's Environmental Protection Act. She also told me something else. The agency wasn't just interested in stopping the activity, they wanted to make an example. Environmental theft wasn't a term thrown around lightly. But in this case, with clear documentation and property lines, it applied. And the penalties, they weren't civil, they were criminal. I spent the afternoon compiling everything else. Drone footage from my nephew, he'd flown it over the trail the day after the trucks left. You could see the disturbance in high resolution. I added timestamps, GPS coordinates, matched soil composition between my creek and their walking path. I wasn't just gathering evidence. I was building a case. 2 days later, a dark green SUV pulled into my driveway. Sandra Finch stepped out, hair in a tight bun, clipboard in hand, wearing the badge of the Yee State Department of Environmental Resources. She greeted me with a warm smile and a firm handshake. I brought a team, she said. We'll be discreet. We want to collect core samples from both sites to confirm extraction. I've already sent a pre-notice to the Compliance Review Board. We walked together toward the creek, passing the deep tire marks, the torn edge of land, the silent water that now bore witness to the violation. I watched as the team worked, professional, calm, methodical. They took samples, measurements, photos. One of them held up the blue construction mat I'd found, placing it into an evidence bag with a practiced hand. Sandra turned to me. Ray, this is textbook. They can't spin their way out of it. And once we file the preliminary report, it becomes a public document. They'll have to answer for it. I nodded slowly. Good, let them. She placed a hand on my shoulder. You did the right thing. And honestly, it's time people started listening to the ones who've been here the longest. I didn't answer right away. I just looked back at the water. The damage was still there, but so was the truth. I hadn't planned for this fight, but now that it had come to me, I wasn't backing down. I didn't survive a war, a marriage, and a lifetime of hard work just to be bulldozed by a group of paper-pushing weekend tyrants. They'd taken from me. Now I'd take something back. There's a kind of quiet that settles over a man when the fire in his chest turns from anger to resolve. That's where I was by the time Sandra and her team finished collecting their samples and drove off in that forest green SUV, leaving behind only soft boot prints and fresh tags pinned to the damaged creek bank. She had assured me the state would move faster than most expected. Environmental theft cases, especially involving registered habitat zones, weren't taken lightly. But I wasn't counting on the state alone. You live long enough, you realize there are two kinds of justice, the one that works on paper and the one you forge with your own two hands. I sat that evening with my records spread across the dining room table like a battlefield map. Topographic surveys, my signed stewardship agreement from 2006. Photographs I'd taken over the last decade showing the gravel bed's gradual thickening, the way the reeds rooted deeper each spring. My wife, Ellen, used to call this space our memory table, where we planned garden layouts, pieced together family photo albums, wrote letters to our sons stationed overseas. Now it was a war room. I pulled open the drawer beneath the hutch and retrieved a battered brown folder. Inside were documents I hadn't touched in over 20 years, my discharge papers from the Army Corps of Engineers, my federal credentials, old site maps I'd helped produce after the '77 floods. My hands shook a little, not from age, but from the weight of what those papers meant. I'd served this country not just in uniform, but in sweat, in knowledge, in the deep respect I held for land and water, and what they mean to a place's soul. My job had been to assess soil strength, calculate erosion risk, ensure communities were built with foresight and humility. And now, here I was, watching the very community that claimed to represent order and standards pillage a watershed, like it was a sandbox. It wasn't just personal. It was an insult to everything I'd stood for. The next morning, I climbed into my old Ford pickup engine, still grumbling to life, with the stubbornness of an old friend, and drove to the county records office. I knew the clerk there, on Janice, from when she was a file assistant fresh out of community college. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Mr. Ellis, been a while." "Too long," I said, tipping my hat. "I need the full plat archive on Washington Parcel 144F. All annotations, easements, and amendments since 1909 DA. And while you're at it, pull any HOA applications for construction or landscaping changes filed this year." She blinked. "That's a big request." "I'll wait." She narrowed her eyes but nodded. "Coffee's still free." I spent 3 hours at a side desk with 2 manila folders, open a pencil in one hand, my magnifying glass in the other. The plat confirmed everything I knew. My boundary ran 5 feet past the bank, not to it. The HOA's property line stopped 47 feet before the creek began. No easement, no shared access, nothing. Then came the kicker. The HOA's Phase 3 beautification project, submitted 6 weeks ago, listed gravel to be sourced via third-party contractor. No purchase receipts, no hauling licenses, no supplier listed. It was filed and approved internally without a city inspector's signature, which meant they didn't have a legal supply source, which meant they knew what they were doing. I photocopied everything, tucked it into my expanding file, and made one more stop at the office of Linda Rothman, a local land use attorney who'd worked pro bono for conservation easements in the area. Her office was warm, filled with old maps and thick books that smelled of time. She greeted me like an old cousin. "Ray Ellis, what brings you to the front lines of bureaucracy?" "Environmental theft," I said, "and a neighborhood board that thinks age equals silence." She raised an eyebrow. "Sit, talk." I laid out the evidence. Every page, every photo, every line of soil data, drone footage, and legal boundary. She didn't interrupt once, just nodded occasionally, lips pursed, eyes sharp. When I finished, she leaned back, drumming her fingers on the desk. "Ray, this is rock solid. Pun not intended. I want to file suit," I said. "Not for money. For trespass. For theft. For public violation of a conservation agreement. I want this on record so it doesn't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone." Linda tapped her pen. "You realize this is going to blow up. They'll dig in slander. Paint you as some bitter old man with too much time and a grudge." "I'm not afraid of a few pamphlets and a gossip chain," I said. "I've been lied about before. Didn't stop the truth from standing." She smiled. "You always did have backbone." We filed the initial notice that afternoon. By the time I returned home, the wind had shifted. Literally. A dry autumn wind swept down from the north, rustling the golden maple leaves like paper. But something else was in the air, something tighter. A feeling I'd only felt on the eve of deployment. The stillness before the pushback. That evening, someone left a flyer on my doorstep. It was printed in bold, blocky type. "Protect our HOA. Don't let one resident derail progress. Crescent Hollow deserves upgrades. Trails, safety, community, spaces. Don't let selfish landowners hoard resources we all need. Attend the board meeting Thursday. Let your voice be heard." No name, no signature. Just a veiled threat disguised as community outreach. I chuckled. They were scared. And when men like Brad got scared, they spun narratives faster than they spun gravel. But this time I wasn't alone. That night, I got a call from a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in months. Sarah Lindholm. A widow, sharp as a tack, with a heart like a freight train. "I heard what they did, Ray," she said. "I live 2 lots down. They took gravel from my side too. I thought it was runoff. But now I'm not so sure. I'm filing suit," I told her. "They're going to answer for it." "I'll testify," she said, no hesitation. "I'll speak. I'll walk into that meeting and tell every damn one of them what I saw." And she wasn't the only one. By sunrise, 3 more neighbors had called. A former school teacher, a retired forestry agent, even a young couple new to the area who'd had their shed construction delayed because the HOA claimed environmental risk, the same HOA that ripped through a protected creek bed without blinking. We weren't just a neighborhood anymore. We were witnesses. And we were waking up. 3 days after Linda filed the preliminary complaint, and the state received Sandra's samples, I found an envelope in my mailbox. It was official stamped with the emblem of the Department of Environmental Protection and addressed to me. Inside was a copy of the Parch Notice of Violation issued to the Crescent Hollow Homeowners Association. Reading it felt like a gavel falling in a silent courtroom. E. Unauthorized. Extraction of natural resources. Parcel Fractional F. Protected watershed. The Department of Environmental Protection has received credible evidence that an organization acting under the authority of the Crescent Hollow Homeowners Association conducted unauthorized removal of aggregate material from protected watershed land registered under the name Raymond A. Ellis. The act constitutes a violation of the Environmental Protection and Stewardship Act, Section 12B, felony environmental theft. A formal investigation is underway. All activity related to HOA Phase 3 development is hereby suspended. My hands trembled not from fear or weakness, but something deeper. A strange mix of vindication, sorrow, and pride. They had tried to make me invisible. Just another relic tucked behind a gate they thought they controlled. But the state had spoken, and I was no longer just a whisper at the edge of the development. I was the storm coming up the hill. I called Sandra that afternoon, and she confirmed it herself. The data matched perfectly, she said. The gravel composition from your creek bed, identical to the samples from the HOA site. Same density, same mineral base, even trace moss spores from the lower creek layers. It's irrefutable. Will there be criminal charges? Not yet. But there could be. Right now, the DEP is pushing for a cease and desist, a hefty fine, and a full public hearing. They want to make an example, Ray, not just of the HOA, but of what happens when land stewards get trampled. I thanked her quietly and hung up. Then I sat by the window for a long time, watching the wind stir the yellow leaves across the pasture. Ellen used to say fall was the season that told the truth, that when the leaves let go, you saw what the tree had been holding all year. I think I finally understood what she meant. By the time Thursday came, the Crescent Hollow board meeting was the most anticipated event in town. Flyers had gone up, some encouraging attendance, some dismissing false accusations, and baseless noise stirred up by a single disgruntled resident. But it didn't work. People came in droves. Chairs were pulled from storage. Some brought lawn chairs. Others stood in the back, arms crossed, silent. I walked into the room with my cane file folder under one arm, my war-era service pin clipped to my coat. Not for attention, but to remind him, what they were facing. Brad Keyes sat at the center of the long table, flanked by the same smug faces who'd once sneered at my complaints. His usual polo was replaced with a blazer, but the tightness around his mouth betrayed him. He looked like a man clinging to a raft already halfway underwater. The meeting began with the usual ritual approval of minutes, budget updates, a brief nod to the Phase 3 beautification delay. No mention of why it was delayed. No mention of the notice. Just a hope that if they breezed through fast enough, no one would ask. Then I stood. People turned as I walked to the microphone, tapping my cane gently on the tile floor. I saw Sarah nod from the second row. I saw Janice from the records office. Even Linda had slipped in at the back, arms folded, eyes sharp. I cleared my throat. My name is Raymond Ellis. I'm the registered owner of Parcel 114F, adjacent to the Crescent Hollow development. For over 50 years, I've lived on that land, cared for it, protected it. And last week, trucks operated by your board or under your board's authorization entered my property without permission and removed over 14 cubic yards of gravel from a registered protected creek bed. I paused, letting the words hang. This wasn't just trespassing. This was theft. And worse, it was environmental theft. You didn't just take stone. You disrupted a habitat. You endangered species already on watch lists. You violated a stewardship agreement recognized by both county and state. And I have the documentation to prove every word. I held up the folder. There were gasps in the room. One of the board members, a younger man I didn't recognize, leaned toward Brad and whispered urgently. Brad shifted in his seat, then tried to speak. Mr. Ellis, with all due respect. No, I said, and the microphone caught it sharp and cold. You'll wait, just like I waited while you dismissed me. Just like I waited while your trucks tore through land you didn't own, scattering 50 years of stewardship like dust. You don't get to interrupt now. Silence. I opened the folder and laid out the first document plat map, then the second soil composition report, then the stewardship agreement, then the state's formal violation notice, each one like a drumbeat. And I'm not the only one, I continued. 3 other residents have contacted me with concerns that gravel was removed near their property lines, that they were never consulted, that permits were pushed through without oversight. This isn't just my fight anymore. A murmur rolled through the crowd. People shifted, leaned forward. I turned back to the microphone. I didn't survive a war, raise a family, build a home from bare earth and cedar posts just to have it disrespected by a board that thinks paperwork and pretense make them kings. You don't own this land. You manage it. And you failed. I stepped back, not dramatically, just steady, quiet. The silence was thick. Then, Sarah Lindholm stood. She walked to the front, her own papers in hand, and gave her account. Then the schoolteacher. Then the young couple. Each told a variation of the same story: neglect, overreach, indifference. Each added to the weight pressing down on that table. By the end, even Brad had gone pale. The board adjourned the meeting early. No decisions made, no announcements. But it didn't matter. The room had changed. The myth of their authority had cracked. That night, I sat on the porch, watching the moon rise over the tree line, holding Ellen's quilt across my knees. The creek murmured in the distance, water gently reclaiming its place. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something deep settle in my chest. Not just satisfaction, but hope. They didn't come with sirens or clipboard parades. No bright jackets, no television crews, no flashing badges. Just a dark, unmarked SUV with government plates turning quietly down the gravel road skirting my property. They parked beside my barn like they'd done it 100 times before. 3 people stepped out, 2 men and a woman. All in plain clothes, but I recognized the weight they carried: professional calm, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Sandra had told me they were coming, but not when. I suppose they didn't want me or anyone else alerting the HOA. Smart move. I walked out to meet them. My boots scuffed the morning dew, and the October wind carried the scent of fresh cedar. It had rained the night before, just enough to make the soil pliable, which would help them get cleaner samples. The taller of the 2 men introduced himself with a quiet nod. Mr. Ellis, I'm Agent Kumar, with the Environmental Crimes Division. This is Agent Hale. And this is our environmental scientist, Dr. Walker. They didn't waste time. We walked the lower slope first, where the creek had been carved. I watched Dr. Walker crouch at the bank using a narrow coring tool to press into the exposed soil. She worked delicately, pulling up layers of gravel and sediment, slipping them into bags labeled with meticulous handwriting. Agent Hale took photographs of everything: ruler against the torn roots, boot prints preserved in the soft clay, the sharp cut where the earth shifted from undisturbed to excavated. He worked like a surgeon, slow and exact. I said little, just pointed where needed. This is the staging area, I told them, gesturing toward the wide patch near the old oak. You can still see the crushed grass even though it's been 4 days. They backed the trucks in here and loaded gravel straight out of the bank. Any idea how many loads they took? Agent Kumar asked. 3 trucks, at least 2 runs each. I'd estimate 14 cubic yards, possibly more. He raised an eyebrow. That matches what we saw on their Greenbelt project. Same quantity spread over the walking path. I took out the laminated survey map I'd brought and laid it on the tailgate of my truck. Here's the exact line. This stretch here, everything below that fence post and across to the maple, is protected watershed. State registered on file since 2006. No one touches it without a permit. Dr. Walker nodded. That's exactly where they took it from. Look, see this? She held up a chunk of sediment. It still has root fragments and decomposed leaf matter. That's riparian buffer soil, undisturbed for years. You don't get that kind of layering from surface gravel. Agent Hale snapped another photo. Any chance they used the contractor? Kumar asked. Or tried to claim the gravel was purchased? They listed third-party sourcing on the permit request, I said. But no receipts, no supplier name, no bill of lading, just the phrase, locally sourced, which they apparently took to mean mine. The agents exchanged glances. This isn't just negligence, Kumar muttered. This is deliberate extraction of protected material, and it was coordinated. The tone of the investigation shifted then. They moved with more urgency, widening their inspection to include the slope near the Eastern Trail. There, beneath a thin layer of fresh mulch, they found crushed gravel so fine and uniform it could only have come from my southern creek bed, where I'd spent years letting the stream shape the stones naturally. It wasn't just gravel to me. It was memory, preservation, patience. They bagged the mulch too likely, looking for traces of cover-up. Dr. Walker pulled out a blacklight and scanned the gravel with a mineral pen. I didn't know they could do that to detect geological signatures, but she seemed pleased. I stood to the side, arms folded, watching it all. And slowly, a feeling I hadn't expected crept in. Relief, because for the first time, it wasn't just my word against theirs. It wasn't just an old man with a file folder being humored at a town meeting. These were state-level experts, and they were seeing what I'd seen. By noon, they were done. Back at the barn, Agent Kumar handed me a preliminary statement to review and sign. This acknowledges that the material sampled matches known protected deposit zones, he said. It's not a final determination, but it locks in the investigation. I signed it without hesitation. Then he added, "We'll be filing a formal environmental theft report within the next 10 business days. The HOA will receive notice. They'll be required to respond within 7. If they don't, or if they lie, we escalate to enforcement action. Will there be fines?" He nodded grimly. If the full amount of damage is confirmed, it could exceed $250,000 in restoration penalties. And that's before criminal charges for unauthorized excavation. I exhaled, a long, slow breath that felt like releasing something I'd carried too long. "Thank you," I said. "Not just for taking this seriously, but for seeing it." He gave the smallest smile. Most people wouldn't have noticed, let alone fought back. I didn't tell him that noticing was all I'd done for the last few years. After Ellen died, the house had gone quiet, too quiet. I noticed the roofline sagging in late autumn, the shift in the creek's bend after a wet spring, the hawks nesting further east than usual, the silence of my son's voice over the phone. I noticed because I had nothing else left to miss. But now I had a purpose again. As the team packed up, Agent Hale pulled me aside. "By the way," he said, lowering his voice, "one of our administrative officers flagged something strange. The HOA's construction contractor, turns out the registered business is owned by the board president's cousin. No proper insurance, no license on file, just a P.O. box and a mobile number." That made my jaw tighten. "You think they use that setup to avoid paper trails?" "I'd bet on it," he said. "And if that's true, this isn't just an environmental case anymore. It's fraud." I nodded slowly. "I'll make sure the neighborhood knows." He grinned. "Something tells me they will." That night, I typed up a short, factual statement and tacked it to the bulletin board by the mailbox station. Update: official investigation underway. State environmental agents have visited my property and confirmed unauthorized extraction of protected gravel. The HOA has been named in a pending environmental theft case. Any residents who have noticed unusual activity near their lots are encouraged to document and report. The truth matters. Raymond Ellis Parcell, 114F. The next morning, I stood back with my coffee and watched neighbors gather. Some read silently, others gasped. A few whispered to each other, then looked up toward the hill, toward my land, toward the man they once called the old crank by the fence. Now they were starting to call me something else. The man who stood his ground. It didn't take long. 3 days after the inspectors visited my property and the bulletin board notice went up, the story broke. A local journalist named Caleb Whitaker, young and sharp, knocked on my door with a notepad in one hand and a recorder in the other. I remembered his father, Hank. Used to fix our fencing back in the 80s. Good man. Honest. Caleb had his eyes and his grit. "Mr. Ellis," he said respectfully, "I got wind that the Department of Environmental Protection filed a violation report on Crescent Hollow's HOA. Word is, it started on your land. Can I sit down with you?" I didn't need to think twice. He sat with me on the porch, notebook on his knee, listening as I told the story beginning to end. No embellishments, just fax map samples and the undeniable truth that a group of HOA officials thought they could raid an old man's land because they believed no one would hold them accountable. He stayed nearly 2 hours, asked smart questions, took photographs not just of the creek bank, but of the soil cores, the flagged staging area, even the preserved tire tracks along the tree line. When he stood to leave, he shook my hand and said, They're not going to like this. But I don't write for their comfort. That night, the article went live. Crescent Hollow HOA, under investigation for environmental theft. A quiet homeowner on the outer border of Crescent Hollow has become the center of an escalating legal firestorm after state officials confirmed that gravel was illegally removed from a protected watershed on his land. Raymond Ellis, 82, is a former land surveyor and retired U.S. Army Corps of Engineers veteran. He says he noticed early morning construction activity 2 weeks ago and followed the tracks to discover his creek bed had been gutted. State environmental scientists matched soil samples and determined that over 14 cubic yards of protected gravel were used in the HOA's recent Phase 3 Greenbelt project. They didn't just take stone, Ellis said. They took a part of land that has been growing and stabilizing naturally for decades. They violated a boundary they had no right to cross. The Department of Environmental Protection has issued a cease and desist order to the HOA, suspending the project and initiating formal investigation. If found liable, the Crescent Hollow HOA may face fines exceeding $250,000 and possible criminal charges related to fraudulent contracting and unauthorized land disturbance. Ellis is not alone. Since the notice went public, at least 3 other homeowners have come forward with similar concerns about unchecked HOA construction. By dawn, the article had been shared over 600 times on the local Facebook group and reposted by 2 regional news outlets. My phone didn't stop buzzing texts, calls, voicemails from residents who had never spoken more than a passing hello to me. Most were supportive. A few were panicked, but the message was clear this had broken open. By late morning, the HOA office locked its doors. A hastily printed sign was taped to the glass. Closed until further notice. No surprise there. Their silence spoke louder than their newsletters ever had. But the real spectacle came 2 days later at the Emergency Town Forum. Normally, those meetings were sleepy affairs, half-empty rooms with bored expressions and lukewarm coffee. But not this time. The high school auditorium was packed. Over 200 people filled the seats, some standing along the walls. Even the mayor showed up. Local news cameras were there too, tucked discreetly into the corners. Brad Keyes sat at this front table, flanked by the remaining board members. Gone was the cocky demeanor. His blazer looked wrinkled, and the sweat shining beneath his collar was impossible to ignore. He kept his hands folded on the table, jaw tight, eyes avoiding mine from across the room. The moderator, a neutral councilwoman named Marissa Lee, opened with the basics. She laid out the facts that the state had launched a formal investigation, that a cease and desist order had been issued, and that public trust in the HOA was under review. Then she opened the floor. The first speaker was Sarah Lindholm. She walked up with confidence, voice clear and resolute. For years, I've paid dues, followed rules, trimmed my hedges to their standards, and trusted that the people running the HOA had some sense of integrity. She said, "Now I find out they not only broke the law, they desecrated our neighbor's land that's been in his care longer than this subdivision has existed. That's not leadership. That's abuse." Applause erupted. The next speaker was the man named Wal Roger. From the East Side, retired firefighter, tough as nails. "My shed proposal was denied because the HOA claimed it would disturb runoff patterns," he said, his voice rising. Meanwhile, they were out there tearing up a protected watershed without blinking. Hypocrisy doesn't even begin to cover it. People clapped louder this time. Then someone shouted from the back, "Where's the money, Brad? Where'd the gravel budget go?" Brad tried to speak, leaning into his mic. "We acted on what we believed were shared use rights. Didn't you sign the permit yourself?" someone shouted. There was a misunderstanding in sourcing," he stammered. "The contractor's your cousin," another voice barked. And that's when it crumbled. A woman stood up, board secretary, Amanda Parrish. She looked pale and shaken. "I can't stay quiet anymore," she said. "I didn't know about the land being protected, but I saw the receipts. There were none." Brad insisted we log it as internal improvement. He said it would save budget, that no one would notice. I thought it was legal. Gasps filled the auditorium. Brad stood, knocking his chair backward. "Amanda, that's not what we—" "Sit down," someone shouted. And he did. The rest unraveled like twine from a fraying rope. More members spoke. One resigned on the spot. Another asked for legal immunity. People started calling for a full audit of the HOA's finances and past development projects. I didn't speak until the end. When the floor opened one last time, I stood not for revenge, not for applause, but because I had to. I'm not here because I hate the HOA, I began quietly. I'm here because the land matters, because stewardship matters. Because once you take from the earth without giving back, you don't just scar soil, you scar trust. The room quieted. I didn't ask for this fight. I didn't want it. But when someone crosses your line, when they dig into what you've built and call it progress, you have to stand up, not with fists, not with fury, but with facts, with the truth. I turned to Brad, who couldn't meet my eyes. You thought I was invisible. Just an old man with too much time and too much land. But I was watching. And now, so is everyone else. I stepped away. No one clapped. No one needed to. Truth didn't need applause. It just needed to be heard. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. Within 48 hours of the town forum, the HOA president, Brad Keyes, had resigned effective immediately, citing health concerns and increasingly hostile community sentiment. His resignation letter, sent through an HOA-wide email blast, dripped with passive-aggressive self-victimization. And though I have always served with integrity and in the best interest of Crescent Hollow, I will not continue to expose myself or my family to unwarranted attacks over misunderstandings beyond my control. He didn't mention the state violation, or the public admission from his own board, or the contractor cousin who had conveniently left town the day before. But his exit was only the first domino. Amanda Parrish, the board secretary who spoke up during the forum, officially stepped down the next day. Two others followed: board treasurer Matt Gaines and landscaping coordinator Patricia Lott, each citing stress burnout or incompatibility with the current direction of the HOA. In less than a week, 5 of the 7 HOA board seats were vacated. The remaining 2 members tried to hold on, scheduling an emergency meeting to discuss rebuilding community confidence, but no one showed up. Instead, the residents met at Sarah Lindholm's house that Saturday. Over 60 people packed into her backyard on folding chairs, picnic blankets, even a few sitting cross-legged in the grass. It felt less like a protest and more like a vigil for something that had once mattered but had rotted under poor stewardship. Linda Rothman, my attorney, stood beside me under the oak tree in Sarah's yard as I addressed the crowd. I never wanted to lead anything. I told them, my voice steady despite the breeze tugging at my coat. I only wanted to be left alone, to care for my land. But what happened to me can't be ignored. And the people responsible, whether out of arrogance or entitlement, should not be allowed to return to power under a different name. Heads nodded. People murmured in agreement. We don't just need a new board, I continued. We need a new culture. One that respects property lines, protects shared spaces, and doesn't treat beautification as a license for exploitation. By the end of the evening, a volunteer committee had formed, made up of retired teachers, small business owners, and even a young father named Marcus, who admitted sheepishly, I've lived here 4 years and never showed up to a single HOA thing until now. But I'm done being silent. We decided to petition for a complete reset of the HOA leadership. According to the bylaws, a 2/3 vote from homeowners could trigger a special election to fill all empty seats. It would take 121 signatures. We got 140 in 2 days. But as our momentum grew, so did the resistance. A small group of die-hard loyalists, mostly those who'd benefited from preferential HOA treatment, began circulating a different flyer. This one didn't come with block fonts or official logos. It came with fear. Don't let this be the end of Crescent Hollow. Outsiders and radicals are trying to destroy our community. They've weaponized one man's land dispute into a political attack. Your property values are at risk. Your HOA protections are slipping away. Say no to the mob. Re-elect experienced leadership. Reclaim order. Restore pride. They didn't mention my name, but the implication was clear. I was the outsider now. The man who'd exposed too much. I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting. Even with the support, even with the facts, on my side, those attacks worm into your mind late at night. I sat more than once on the porch with Ellen's quilt across my lap, wondering if I'd done the right thing, wondering if I should have let the gravel go. But then I'd hear the creak, still scarred, still shallow, still waiting for healing, and I'd remember why I couldn't look away. The following week, something changed the tide entirely. Sandra called. There's been an update, she said. The environmental violation was reviewed by the Attorney General's office. Given the falsified permit and the contractor's conflict of interest, they're opening a secondary investigation into fraud and misuse of HOA funds. I stood motionless on the porch listening to the wind whistle through the hollow reed grass along the creek bed. They're not just going after the board anymore, she added. They're going after the system that let this happen, and they want you to testify formally. I didn't hesitate. Went, next Thursday, downtown, State Building. I'll be with you the entire time. I called Linda the next morning. She reviewed the deposition outline with me in her office, and by the time we were done, she leaned across the table and smiled. You've already won the moral argument, Ray. Now we win the legal one. Thursday came, and I wore the same gray jacket I'd worn the day I retired from the Corps of Engineers. It still fit mostly. My shoes were shined. My back was straight. And when I walked into that building, it wasn't with anger. It was with purpose. The deposition was long, but not difficult. The state lawyers were courteous, but thorough. I laid out the timeline, submitted every document, every drone photo, every sample match, and most importantly, the permit application with no sourcing signed by Brad Keyes himself. I left the building tired but unburdened, like I'd finally dropped the last stone I'd been carrying. 2 weeks later, a notice went out to every homeowner in Crescent Hollow. By unanimous decision, the interim HOA Oversight Committee has dissolved the existing development board structure. A full community vote will be held to install new leadership. In accordance with state recommendations, financial oversight will include third-party auditing, and no future construction will be permitted without independent environmental review. It was the sound of a system collapsing and something cleaner rising from the rubble. That Sunday, Sarah held another gathering, this time celebratory. There was pie. Kids ran through her yard. The air was soft with the scent of leaves and smoke and something like hope. Marcus raised a toast with his plastic cup. To Ray, he said, for standing up when the rest of us forgot how. I raised my cup too, smiling, but my voice was quiet when I replied. To the land, I said, and to those who still listen to it. The rains came in November, steady, cold, and patient, like a long exhale from the hills beyond the creek. I sat on the porch, wrapped in Ellen's quilt, a thermos of black coffee, warming my hands, and watched the land drink. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I had to guard it. There were no strange tire tracks, no unmarked trucks, no heavy footsteps disturbing the tall grass by the water's edge. The fight was over, and now something better had to begin. I walked down to the creek that afternoon, slow and deliberate. The path was still muddy where they'd torn through, but nature, stubborn and graceful, had begun to reclaim her ground. New shoots of sedge grass broke through the wet earth. Fallen leaves clung to the banks, forming quiet, natural dams. The gravel hadn't returned, not yet, but the rhythm of the water was softening again. No longer angry, just tired. Like me. Over the last few weeks, the calls had slowed. The headlines faded. The HOA board was officially restructured under a new charter, and while I declined to run for any position, I accepted an advisory role, unpaid, unofficial, but respected. Still, it wasn't enough. I couldn't undo what they'd done. Couldn't unscar the bank or bring back the roots they'd ripped from the creek bed. But I could do something more meaningful than sue or punish or lecture. I could build something that would outlast all of it. That week, I called the County Land Trust office and asked for an appointment. I brought my folder, yes, that folder, and sat down with a kind woman named Rebecca, who listened without once checking her watch. I told her I wanted to donate a portion of my land, not sell, not lease, donate it permanently as a conservation easement. It'll protect the area from any future development, she explained. And you can outline specific restoration priorities in the charter: habitat, rebuilding, native plant reinforcement, even educational signage. That's exactly what I want, I said. She smiled. Most people don't do this, especially not men your age. I chuckled. Most men my age don't have a creek that survived war storms and HOA meetings. We laughed. I named the easement Ellen's Reach. It felt right. Ellen had always wanted the area by the bend, where the sycamore shadows danced at sunset, to become a quiet spot for school kids to sit and learn about water erosion routes and time. Now it would be. I set aside a strip 30 feet wide and 180 yards long, from the fence to the far bank, marked every 20 feet, with a small wooden post carved with her initials, ER. Rebecca sent out the press release. The story ran on page 2 of the Oakfield Ledger. Crescent Hollow veteran donates land for conservation. In a gesture of restoration and remembrance, Raymond Ellis, 82, has permanently donated a portion of his creekside property as a conservation easement to honor his late wife and ensure the protection of native habitat damaged earlier this year by unauthorized development. The parcel, now registered under the name Ellen's Reach, will be maintained by the Oakfield Land Trust and used for public education, habitat recovery, and long-term water quality observation. We've seen what happens when people take without asking, Ellis said. This is my way of giving back, not just for what was lost, but for what still lives here. That last quote made me tear up a little, not because it sounded poetic, but because it was true. That weekend, dozens of volunteers came to help start restoration. Some brought tools, others brought native plants and shovels. Marcus came with his daughter, Ella, who wore a shirt with a cartoon frog and the words, "Creek Keeper in Training." Sarah brought coffee and donuts. Even Caleb, the young reporter, came to help dig. And they listened. As I explained how the gravel formed over time, how the slow bends of the water created natural shelves, how the reeds weren't weeds, but protectors of the stream's edge. I showed them where the salamanders nested in spring, where Ellen used to sit with her sketch pad, where I once proposed to her beneath a maple that no longer stands. It wasn't just dirt and water anymore. It was memory. It was legacy. It was healing. Over the next month, we built a small trailhead at the edge of the easement, marked with a wooden sign carved by the local Boy Scouts. It read, Ellen's Reach, protected forever. Dedicated to quiet places and the people who protect them. Underneath, in smaller letters, land donated by Raymond Ellis, USACE steward husband, friend. I hadn't asked for that last line, but I didn't object. Winter came with a gentleness I hadn't felt in years. Snow dusted the tops of the fence posts. The creek slowed, hardened. The gravel bank, though wounded, held strong. And every morning I walked the edge cane in handbreath, rising in visible puffs, feeling the land exhale beneath my boots. One morning, Marcus stopped by with Ella again. She handed me a drawing done in crayon of a tree, a frog, and what I assumed was me stick figure, and all standing with a big smile beside a sign that read, Ellen's Reach. Are you going to be buried here someday? She asked innocently. Marcus blushed. Ella, honey. I smiled. Maybe, I said. But not for a while. There's still work to do. She nodded very seriously. Good. You're the boss of the creek. I laughed. No, sweetheart. The creek's the boss of me. They left a few minutes later, and I stood alone watching their footprints fade behind them. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was sacred. In the months that followed, more residents reached out, asking how to designate parts of their land for protection, how to start compost programs, how to install native gardens instead of ornamental gravel beds. The new HOA board, made up of people who had once been too timid to speak, passed a new charter clause requiring ecological review for every project over 5,000. Change doesn't always come in thunder. Sometimes it comes in ripples, and sometimes it starts with a wound. One evening, as the last of the sunset faded behind the ridge, I stood at the bend of the creek and looked down into the water. The reflection staring back was older, sure, grayer, but behind the eyes was something I hadn't seen in years. Peace. I bent down, cupped a handful of water, and whispered a promise into the wind. I couldn't stop them from taking, but I can spend the rest of my days giving. And I meant it. Spring came slow and soft that year. The kind of spring you almost miss if you're not paying attention, where the snow doesn't so much melt as quietly retreat, and the robins don't announce their return, but simply appear one day, already pecking the thawed earth. I noticed because I was looking, because I had nothing left to fight, no more to prove. And in that silence, I found something deeper than victory. I found restoration. By April, the state case had concluded. The Department of Environmental Protection issued its final report. I received a formal letter by certified mail, a heavy envelope stamped with the agency's seal, and a summary of enforcement actions taken against the Crescent Hollow HOA. Final ruling violation confirmed. Findings indicate unauthorized extraction of protected aggregate from Parcel 114F under the stewardship of Raymond Ellis. The HOA violated Section 12B of the Environmental Protection and Stewardship Act. Penalties issued include $215,000 in environmental fines, $68,000 in restoration fees payable to the Oakfield Wood Trust, a permanent bar on construction within 100 feet of Ellen's Reach without independent environmental approval. State enforcement reserves the right to revisit the site annually. All violations will remain on public record for a minimum of 15 years. I set the letter down slowly and let out a breath that felt years old. It wasn't just about the money. It was about truth etched in paper, now a matter of public fact. They couldn't deny it anymore. They couldn't talk around it. The record was sealed in ink. A few days later, I received an unexpected visitor. Brad Keyes. He didn't drive up in a truck this time. He walked alone, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched. I saw him coming from the far end of the property where the HOA line met the tree line, and for a moment I thought he might turn around. But he kept walking slow and uncertain until he reached the porch steps. I was already outside, sanding a section of the old bench Ellen used to sit on. Afternoon, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. I didn't reply, just kept sanding. The sound filled the space between us. He cleared his throat. I heard the final ruling came through. I nodded. Silence again. The birds were louder than he was. I didn't come to argue, he added. I came to say I was wrong. And I'm sorry. The sanding stopped. He stood there looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. No clipboard, no smug smirk, just a man, stripped of pretense. Why now, I asked quietly. Because everything I thought I controlled crumbled. And because I saw what you did after. You didn't burn it all down. You built something. I didn't respond right away. Eventually, I gestured toward the bench beside me. He hesitated, then sat. The two of us watched the creek together just as it bent out of view beneath the trees. It had been a long time since I sat next to someone in silence and didn't feel anger clawing at my chest. After a few minutes, he spoke again. I resigned from the HOA permanently. Sold my place. Moving in with my sister upstate for a while, I think it's time I learned how to listen. I gave him a short nod. Start with the land. It doesn't lie. He nodded, almost gratefully, then stood. Thanks for not throwing a punch, he said, a small sad smile curling on his lips. I didn't have to, I replied. The truth did the job. When he walked away, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. Later that week, I was asked to speak at the Oakfield Town Hall for Earth Day. The new HOA board, now fully elected by the residents, had partnered with the Oakfield Land Trust to organize a public dedication of Ellen's Reach. I wore my old Course of Engineers pin on my lapel. The auditorium was full neighbors, school kids, even city council members. I walked to the podium, my notes folded in my pocket, unused. I didn't need them. I just looked at the crowd and let my voice do what it had always done, best speak softly but truthfully. This land was never mine, I began. Not really. I may have held the deed, planted the trees, mended the fences. But the land is older than me, wiser than me. And like all things borrowed, it demands care. A hush settled in the room. I fought for this land not out of pride, but out of duty. Because when we forget to protect what is sacred, be it earth, water, or memory, we lose more than property. We lose our place in the story. I looked down at the front row where Ella sat with her hands folded, listening intently. Ellen used to tell me that the world doesn't need louder voices. It needs steadier hands. I didn't always understand what she meant. But I do now. I paused. Ellen's Reach is not just a trail. It's not just gravel and water. It's a promise that we can learn, that we can change, that we can turn harm into healing. The applause rose slowly, but when it came, it was warm and whole, and filled with something that didn't need explaining. That night, I returned home to find a letter waiting in my mailbox. Handwritten, from a boy named Liam in the 4th grade. Dear Mr. Ellis, we went to your creek today and saw baby frogs. Our teacher said you saved the water, and now the frogs have a home again. When I grow up, I want to protect creeks too. My mom said you were very brave. I think so too. P.S. Your wife must have been really nice because Ellen's Reach is beautiful. Sincerely, Liam. I sat down right there on the porch, tears blurring the ink, and whispered into the dusk. She was Liam. She really was. In the end, justice didn't come in one sharp blow. It came like the creek, steady, winding, slow. It wore down resistance not with violence, but with persistence.
And I.
I didn't win by shouting. I won by staying, by knowing my boundaries, and by never forgetting that even the quietest land has a voice. All you have to do is listen.